Chapter 1. The mysterious arrival. It was an evening unlike any other in London. The autumn chill had begun to bite at the edges of the city, and the golden light of the setting sun was quickly giving way to the shadows of the coming night. Yet, in the drawing-rooms and dimly lit parlours of the upper-crust society, a different kind of warmth prevailed. It was a warmth born of champagne flutes clinking together, laughter mingling with the crackling of fireplaces, and the distinct hum of whispered secrets. At precisely 6:30, the doors of the elegant town-home belonging to Lord Gilbert Trevelyan opened to reveal a figure who had long been a stranger to the confines of the London social scene. Hercule Poirot, with his meticulously combed moustache and unfaltering posture, entered the room with his usual air of elegance, the weight of the world seemingly resting on his slender shoulders. His eyes, however, gleamed with a quiet certainty, certainty born from years of solving mysteries that most people would rather not even consider. Tonight was a special occasion, and Poirot's invitation had been made not out of necessity, but rather out of curiosity. Lord Gilbert Trevelyan, a man of vast wealth and influence, had extended the invitation himself, a gesture that intrigued Poirot. There were very few people in London who could afford to invite the famous Belgian detective to dinner, but Trevelyan had done so with a purpose. The grand salon where the party was being held was filled with the elite of society, bankers, diplomats, high society women draped in silks and diamonds, and the occasional artist or intellectual. They all seemed to be enjoying themselves, their laughter echoing off the velvet-lined walls as they sipped their drinks and exchanged pleasantries. But there was something peculiar about this gathering, Poirot noted, as his eyes scanned the room. Despite the apparent merriment, an undercurrent of tension seemed to run through the crowd, a tension that was barely perceptible, but no less real. He could feel it in the way people shifted uncomfortably when they thought no one was watching, or in the fleeting glances exchanged between a few individuals who looked as if they were hiding something. Poirot had barely set foot into the room when a familiar voice called out to him from across the room. "Ah, Poirot, I am so pleased you could make it." Lord Trevelyan's voice boomed as he strode over to his guest, his hand outstretched in warm welcome. Poirot nodded with a smile, taking the proffered hand in his own. "It is a pleasure, as always, my dear Trevelyan. You are, I believe, the only man in London who could make such a grand occasion out of something so simple as a dinner party." Trevelyan chuckled, though there was a hint of nervousness in his eyes. "Ah, you see, Poirot, it is not the dinner that is of consequence tonight. No, it is something much more important." Poirot raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And what, I ask, is so important, my friend?" Trevelyan motioned for Poirot to follow him, leading him to a small, dimly lit corner of the room. There, resting atop a polished wooden pedestal, was a large glass display case. Inside the case, illuminated by a soft light, sat an object that instantly captured Poirot's attention: a golden hourglass. The object itself was nothing like any hourglass Poirot had seen before. It was large, ornate, and intricately designed, its frame made of pure gold, with delicate engravings that seemed to shimmer in the light. The sand inside the hourglass, however, was not the usual white or brown, but a deep, almost unnatural shade of red. Poirot studied the hourglass with interest. A remarkable object, he remarked, his eyes narrowing as he examined it more closely. May I ask what its significance is? Lord Trevelyan leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It is a family heirloom, Poirot. The Trevelyan family has possessed it for generations, passed down from one heir to the next. It is said to have mysterious powers that no one fully understands. Some even believe it is cursed. Poirot's expression remained neutral, though his mind began to whirl with possibilities. Cursed, you say? That is quite an extraordinary claim, my friend. Yes, Trevelyan continued, his voice growing even quieter. But it is more than just a superstition. In recent months, strange things have been happening. People have begun to speak of the hourglass in hushed tones, and I have received anonymous letters warning me of its dangers. Poirot's eyes flickered with interest. And have you had any cause to worry, my dear Trevelyan? I wish I could say no, Trevelyan replied, his face shadowed with concern. But strange occurrences have begun to take place in the house. First, there was the matter of the missing letter, the one addressed to my cousin Julia. It was nowhere to be found when I went to retrieve it from the post. Then there was the incident with the clock in the library. It stopped at precisely the hour the hourglass was placed in the room. And now, well, there is something else. Poirot's curiosity was piqued. What else, mon ami? Trevelyan looked around nervously, as though afraid someone might overhear. The servants have begun to leave. One by one, they have resigned, all citing a feeling of unease. They claim the house is haunted, that strange noises come from the room where the hourglass is kept. Poirot turned to face the hourglass once more, his mind ticking away as he considered the facts. And you believe that these occurrences are somehow related to the hourglass? That is exactly what I fear, Poirot, Trevelyan said, his voice low. I cannot explain it, but I feel as though the hourglass has some sort of power over those who are near it. Something dark, something malevolent. It has caused a rift in my family, and I fear that it will lead to something far worse if it is not dealt with soon. Poirot stood in silence for a moment, his mind working through the implications of what Lord Trevelyan had said. There was no question that the hourglass held some sort of mystery. Whether it was supernatural or simply the product of a collective anxiety, Poirot could not yet say. But he was certain of one thing. Something was amiss, and it was his task to uncover the truth. I will help you, my friend, Poirot said finally, his voice calm but resolute. I will solve the enigma of the golden hourglass. Trevelyan sighed, in relief, visibly grateful for the detective's offer of assistance. You have no idea how much this means to me, Poirot. I am at my wit's end. Poirot gave a small smile, his eyes narrowing as he studied the hourglass once more. I will start by speaking to those who are closest to the object. The servants, your family, and anyone else who might have knowledge of the hourglass's history. There is more to this than meets the eye. I am certain of it. Trevelyan nodded eagerly. I will gather them all together, Poirot. You may question them as you see fit. As Poirot turned to leave the room, his thoughts were already whirling, his mind racing through the various possibilities. A cursed object, a missing letter, strange occurrences. There was more to this than just superstition. Poirot knew it. The golden hourglass had a story to tell, and he would uncover it piece by piece, no matter where the investigation led. For Hercule Poirot, there was no mystery too obscure, no enigma too complicated, and as he stepped into the shadows of the Trevelyan estate, he knew that the key to solving this puzzle lay just out of reach, but not for long. Chapter 2. A Family Divided. The next morning, Hercule Poirot sat in the grand library of Trevelyan House, a room filled with the rich scent of polished mahogany and the lingering dust of old books. The morning light filtered in through heavy velvet drapes, illuminating shelves lined with first editions and rare manuscripts. Yet, despite the room's scholarly charm, Poirot could not ignore the atmosphere of unease that hung over it. But Trevelyan had promised to gather those closest to the house, the family members, the remaining servants, and anyone else who might hold information regarding the golden hourglass. Poirot, ever a meticulous observer, prepared to unravel the tangled web of history, emotions, and secrets that surrounded the mysterious object. Seated across from him was Julia Trevelyan, the Lord's cousin, a woman in her mid-30s with sharp cheekbones and piercing green eyes that darted about the room as if expecting an unseen menace to emerge from the shadows. Beside her sat Hugo Trevelyan, Lordy, Trevelyan's younger half-brother, a man of rakish charm and an air of disinterest, his fingers tapping idly against the armrest of his chair. Opposite them, with an expression of barely concealed irritation, was Miss Lydia Mortimer, Lord Trevelyan's long-time secretary and confidant, a woman of rigid posture and steel-grey hair pinned back into an uncompromising bun. Standing behind them, arms crossed and brow furrowed, was James Atkinson, the butler who had served the household for the better part of 2 decades. He was the only remaining senior servant after the others had abandoned their posts in the wake of the strange disturbances that had plagued the estate. Poirot glanced at each of them in turn, before speaking, his voice calm yet firm. Mesdames et messieurs, Lord Trevelyan has requested my assistance in investigating the peculiar incidents surrounding the golden hourglass. Before we proceed, I would like each of you to describe, in your own words, what you know of its history and its alleged effects. A silence followed, heavy and expectant. Julia Trevelyan was the first to speak. She smoothed an invisible crease on her skirt before beginning in a controlled, almost clinical tone. The golden hourglass has been in our family for generations. It is said to have been acquired by one of our ancestors, Lord Percival Trevelyan, during his travels in Egypt in the early 1800s. Supposedly, it was taken from a temple, a cursed relic, or so the legend claims. She paused, then continued with a faintly sceptical smile. Of course, one must take such stories with a grain of salt. Families love their myths. But there is no denying that misfortune has a way of following those who possess it. My father always said the hourglass was to be respected, but never meddled with. Respected but never meddled with? Poirot repeated thoughtfully. And yet it is on display in the salon for all to see. Julia's lips pressed into a thin line. That was Gilbert's doing, she admitted. He insists that the past is the past, and that we ought not to be bound by old superstitions. At this, Hugo let out a dry chuckle. Gilbert has never been one for caution. he remarked, his voice edged with amusement. Though I dare say he's been regretting his boldness lately. The missing letter, the stopped clocks, the whispers in the corridors. It all coincides with him deciding to move the hourglass from its usual resting place in the study to that grand pedestal in the salon, almost as if the thing resents being put on display. Poirot tilted his head, intrigued. You imply, monsieur, that the object itself has some agency in these matters. Hugo shrugged, his expression unreadable. I don't claim to believe in curses, Poirot, but I do believe in bad luck, and that hourglass has brought plenty of it. Miss Mortimer, who had remained silent until now, gave an exasperated sigh. This is all nonsense, she said briskly. Lord Trevelyan is a sensible man, but even he is allowing himself to be swayed by foolish talk. The hourglass is nothing more than an antique, an expensive one, yes, but hardly the cause of all these so-called disturbances. The problem lies elsewhere, if you ask me. Poirot leaned forward slightly. And where do you believe the problem lies, mademoiselle? The older woman pursed her lips. In people's imaginations, she said, and in those who have something to gain from spreading fear. Her gaze flickered, almost imperceptibly, towards Hugo before she continued. Superstition is a convenient excuse, Monsieur Poirot. Convenient for those who might wish to create chaos under the guise of an old family legend. Hugo gave a slow smile, one that did not quite reach his eyes. You have quite the suspicious mind, Miss Mortimer, he murmured. I do hope you're not implying anything untoward. Miss Mortimer held his gaze unflinchingly. I am simply stating facts. Before Poirot could respond, James Atkinson, the butler, cleared his throat. If I may, sir, he said, his voice steady but laced with unease, and I have served this house for many years. I have never been one to give in to superstition. But the things I have seen of late, they trouble me. Poirot studied the man intently. Tell me, mon ami, what have you seen? Atkinson hesitated before answering. Doors opening on their own, candles snuffed out without a breeze. And last night, I swear, I heard footsteps in the study, but when I entered the room, there was no one there. The room fell into silence. Even Miss Mortimer seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Poirot tapped his fingertips together, his mind sifting through the pieces of information presented before him. There was something here, something hidden beneath layers of superstition, suspicion, and perhaps even deceit. The question, mes amis, is not whether the hourglass is cursed, Poirot said finally, his voice measured. The question is, who among you stands to benefit from the fear it has created? His words hung in the air, an unspoken challenge to each person in the room. Julia looked contemplative. Hugo smiled faintly, as though entertained. Miss Mortimer's expression was unreadable, though her fingers tapped lightly against the armrest. Atkinson, for all his composure, seemed uneasy. Poirot knew that this mystery was only beginning, but he also knew that before long the golden hourglass would reveal its secrets, and he, Hercule Poirot, would be the one to uncover them. Chapter 3. The Shadow over Trevelyan. House Poirot sat in quiet contemplation in the drawing-room of Trevelyan House, his small, elegant hands resting upon the arms of his chair. The grand room, with its stately furniture and imposing portraits of long-deceased Trevelyan's exuded an air of wealth and tradition. And yet, beneath the surface of aristocratic dignity, Poirot could sense the undercurrent of unease that rippled through the household. The golden hourglass, the centerpiece of the growing anxiety, stood proudly upon its pedestal in the salon, its intricate frame catching the flickering light from the chandeliers. Though it appeared an innocent enough object, an exquisite piece of craftsmanship, it had, in recent days, become the subject of whispered fears, missing letters, and unexplained happenings. Poirot allowed his gaze to drift toward his friend and steadfast companion, Captain Arthur Hastings, who sat opposite him, his brow furrowed in thought. Hastings had been unusually quiet since their arrival at Trevelyan House, his natural scepticism at war with the strange events they had been drawn into. "You seem troubled, mon ami," Poirot remarked gently. "Your silence is most unlike you." Hastings shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearing his throat before responding. "It's just that, well, Poirot, I can't make head nor tail of this business. One moment we're dealing with family squabbles over an old relic, and the next we're hearing talk of curses and ghostly footsteps. It doesn't sit right with me." Poirot smiled knowingly. "Ah, my dear Hastings, you are a man of reason, yes? And yet even the most reasonable man cannot ignore the little grey cells when they whisper that something is amiss." Hastings let out a sigh. "Well, I suppose you have some theory already." Poirot tapped a finger lightly against his temple. "A theory, no, but a direction, perhaps." At that moment, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Miss Julia Trevelyan, her tall frame and confident stride betraying little of the apprehension that flickered in her eyes. "I trust I'm not disturbing you, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice smooth but tinged with tension. "Not at all, mademoiselle," Poirot assured her. "In fact, your timing is most fortuitous. I was just remarking to Hastings that a mystery such as this is like a puzzle. Every piece must be placed just so before the picture is clear." Julia arched an eyebrow. "And have you placed any pieces yet?" Poirot steepled his fingers. "Ah, but that is what I wish to discuss. Tell me, mademoiselle, how well do you know your cousin, Lord Trevelyan?" Julia stiffened slightly. "Gilbert and I, we are family. We were close once, though in recent years we have drifted. He is a man of ambition, and I have my own affairs to manage. And these recent disturbances, the missing letter, the stopped clocks, how do you say, unsettling atmosphere." She hesitated before replying. "They are unsettling, yes, but I do not believe in curses, Monsieur Poirot. Someone in this house is playing a game, and my cousin is too proud to admit he may be a pawn in it." Poirot nodded, absorbing her words. "And you, mademoiselle, are you a player in this game?" Green eyes flashed. "If I were, I would hope to be the one winning." With that, she inclined her head and excused herself, leaving Poirot and Hastings alone once more. Hastings let out a low whistle. "A formidable woman, that one!" Poirot chuckled. "Indeed, and formidable women often hide formidable secrets." Their conversation was soon interrupted by the arrival of Lord Trevelyan himself. He looked fatigued, his normally stern features lined with worry. He wasted no time in addressing Poirot. "There has been another incident," he said grimly. Poirot straightened. Ah, mon cher, do not keep me in suspense. Lord Trevelyan exhaled. One of my father's old journals has gone missing. It was kept in the study, locked away. But this morning the lock was broken, and the journal was gone. Curious, Poirot murmured. And the contents of this journal? My father wrote extensively about the family history, our possessions, and yes, the golden hourglass. I had planned to review it, to see if there was anything of importance in its pages. But now... Poirot rose gracefully to his feet. Then let us not delay. To the study, if you please. The three men made their way down the dimly lit corridor, the polished wood floors creaking under their steps. When they reached the study, they found the heavy wooden desk drawer forced open, the shattered remains of the lock still clinging to its frame. Poirot examined the damage with a keen eye. This was done with force. The intruder did not have a key. Hastings frowned. So, it wasn't a servant? Non, mon ami. A servant would have moved more discreetly. No, this was an act of desperation. He turned to Lord Trevelyan, who, apart from yourself, knew about the journal's location. Trevelyan hesitated. Miss Mortimer, my secretary, would have known. Perhaps Julia, though I never discussed it with her. And my brother, Hugo, though I doubt he had any interest. Poirot remained silent for a moment, his eyes drifting to the bookshelves that lined the study walls. Someone in this house is afraid, he said softly. Afraid of what your father may have written. As he spoke, a sudden sharp noise echoed from the corridor outside. A crash, followed by hurried footsteps. Hastings sprang into action, rushing toward the door. Poirot followed swiftly, though with his usual measured pace. They emerged into the hallway just in time to see the retreating figure of a man disappearing down the far end. "After him, Hastings!" Poirot urged. Hastings did not need further encouragement. He charged down the hallway, but the intruder was quick. By the time Hastings reached the end of the corridor, the figure had vanished into the shadows. Panting slightly, Hastings turned back to Poirot. He got away, but I swear, Poirot, he was carrying something. Poirot's gaze was thoughtful. Then we must consider, mon ami, what was worth stealing, and what was worth running for. Lord Trevelyan, having caught up to them, looked grim. This is getting out of hand, Poirot. First the missing letter, then the disturbances, and now my father's journal is stolen. Poirot patted his arm reassuringly. Courage, my friend. The culprit is within these walls, and if Hercule Poirot is correct, which he always is, the golden hourglass is the key to everything. Trevelyan nodded, but Poirot could see the doubt in his eyes. Let us return to the drawing room, Poirot suggested. I have much to think about. As they made their way back, Poirot allowed himself a small smile. The game was afoot, and the pieces were finally beginning to move. Soon the true picture would emerge, and when it did, Hercule Poirot would be ready. Chapter 4. The Weight of the Past. The following morning, the atmosphere at Trevelyan House was thick with tension. The theft of the late Lord Trevelyan's journal had shaken the household. Conversations were hushed, glances were furtive, and suspicion lingered in the air like an uninvited guest. Poirot, ever the observer, noted these subtle shifts as he enjoyed a well-prepared breakfast of toast, preserves, and a perfectly boiled egg. Across the table Captain Hastings was less composed. He had barely touched his plate, instead stirring his tea absent-mindedly, his mind clearly preoccupied. "I say, Poirot," Hastings began, setting down his spoon, "we should be out there looking for that journal. Heaven knows what was in it. And that thief, we almost caught him last night. If only I'd been a second faster." Poirot gave a slight shake of his head. "Patience, mon ami. One does not run after the truth as if it were a fox in the hunt. No, one must set the proper trap, wait for the fox to emerge of its own accord." Hastings huffed. "And in the meantime?" Poirot dabbed at his mouth with his napkin before replying. "In the meantime, we must understand why someone would risk everything to steal an old man's writings." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Miss Mortimer, Lord Trevelyan's secretary. Her normally composed expression was marred by worry, and she clutched a stack of papers in her hands. "I hate to disturb you, Monsieur Poirot," she began, "but I thought you might want to see this." Poirot gestured for her to proceed, and she carefully laid down the papers on the table. "I was going through the household accounts this morning, as usual, when I noticed something peculiar. A withdrawal from Lord Trevelyan's personal estate, a huge, rather large sum of money, in fact. It was taken out in cash just a week before his death." Hastings frowned. "That doesn't seem too unusual. The man was wealthy. Perhaps he had some private expenses." Miss Mortimer pursed her lips. Lord Trevelyan was always meticulous about his financial dealings. Large cash withdrawals were rare. And what's stranger, there's no record of where the money went. It simply vanished. Poirot's fingers traced the edge of the papers thoughtfully. A disappearance of money, and now a disappearance of his journal. It is most intriguing. He looked up at Miss Mortimer. "Tell me, mademoiselle, was there anything in Lord Trevelyan's recent affairs that seemed unusual? Any new acquaintances? Any unexpected meetings?" She hesitated before replying. "Now that you mention it, there was one matter. Lord Trevelyan had recently received several letters from a solicitor in London, a Mr. Edgar Lytton. I remember because he was most insistent that Lord Trevelyan respond. But when I asked my employer about it, he dismissed it as unimportant." Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. "And do you have these letters?" Miss Mortimer nodded. "I kept a copy of one. It's in my office. I can fetch it now." Poirot smiled. "Mademoiselle, you are a treasure." As Miss Mortimer left, Hastings turned to Poirot. "Do you think this solicitor has something to do with the theft of the journal?" Poirot sipped his tea. "Perhaps, or perhaps, Hastings, it is all part of a larger design." Shortly after, Miss Mortimer returned with the letter. Poirot took it delicately, scanning the neatly typed words. "Dear Lord Trevelyan, I write to you again regarding the matter of great urgency. As I have stressed previously, the claims made by the party in question are not to be ignored, and I must insist that you respond at your earliest convenience. Failure to do so may result in consequences most undesirable. Yours sincerely, Edgar Lytton, Solicitor Poirot." Read it twice before handing it to Hastings. "What do you make of it?" Hastings frowned. "It sounds like a legal matter of some kind. Perhaps a dispute over property?" Poirot nodded. "Indeed. Or perhaps, mon ami, a claim to something of great value." At that moment the door to the breakfast-room swung open, and Lord Trevelyan strode in, looking particularly agitated. "You must come at once," he announced. "Something else has happened." Poirot and Hastings exchanged glances before rising and following him. They were led to the library, where Julia Trevelyan stood near the fireplace, her expression carefully controlled. Beside her, Hugo Trevelyan leaned against a chair, arms crossed. Lord Trevelyan pointed to a space on the wooden desk. "Last night this drawer was broken into, and my father's journal was stolen. This morning, the drawer to the cabinet was also forced open." Poirot stepped closer, inspecting the damage. "And what was kept here, milord?" Lord Trevelyan's mouth tightened. "A collection of old documents, mostly financial records, but also a few personal letters of my father's." Julia spoke up. "Whatever was taken, it wasn't just about money. Someone wants to erase something." Poirot straightened. "Then the question remains, what was so dangerous in these letters that someone would go to such lengths to destroy them?" Hugo scoffed. "Isn't it obvious? It's all about that damned hourglass." There was a silence. Poirot's expression remained neutral. "What do you mean, monsieur?" Hugo shrugged. "My father was obsessed with it. He always said it was more than just an antique, that it held power." Hastings snorted. "Power? Come now, surely you don't believe that?" Julia, however, was watching Poirot carefully. "You don't seem surprised." Poirot inclined his head. "Ah, mademoiselle, I have learned never to be surprised when it comes to matters of greed, ambition, and human folly." Lord Trevelyan sighed. "I don't know what's happening in this house, Poirot, but I want it to end." Poirot folded his arms. "And it will, mon cher. But first, I must ask you something important." Lord Trevelyan stiffened. "Yes?" "Your father withdrew a large sum of money a week before his death. Do you know why?" The question had an immediate effect. Lord Trevelyan's face darkened. Julia and Hugo exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, Lord Trevelyan spoke. "No, and that, Monsieur Poirot, is something that has troubled me greatly." Poirot pressed his fingertips together. "Then I believe, milord, that it is time I paid a visit to this Mr. Edgar Lytton." As Poirot made his pronouncement, the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the hour, a sound that echoed through the house, heavy with the weight of time. Chapter 5. A Visit to London. The following morning, Poirot and Hastings set out for London. The train ride was smooth, and Poirot, ever meticulous, spent the journey adjusting his cuffs and ensuring his moustache was in perfect symmetry. Hastings, on the other hand, fidgeted with impatience. "I say, Poirot, this solicitor fellow, what, do you think he knows?" Poirot tilted his head slightly. "That is precisely what we are going to find out, mon ami. A solicitor is a keeper of secrets, n'est-ce pas? He deals in legal matters, inheritances and disputes. But above all, Hastings, he deals in truth, though sometimes one must pull at the threads to reveal it." They arrived at Chancery Lane, where Edgar Lytton's office was located. The building was old but well maintained, with polished brass fixtures and an air of quiet authority. Poirot rapped on the wooden door, and a prim, bespectacled secretary answered. "Mr. Lytton is engaged at the moment," she informed them, adjusting her glasses. "Do you have an appointment?" Poirot smiled charmingly. "Alas, non, but we have come on a matter of some importance." Would you be so kind as to inform Mr. Lytton that Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings wish to speak with him regarding Lord Trevelyan?" At the mention of the name, the secretary's demeanour changed slightly. Her lips pursed, and she hesitated before nodding. "Very well. One moment, gentlemen." After a brief wait, they were ushered into a well-appointed office where Edgar Lytton sat behind a mahogany desk, his fingers steepled. He was a thin man with greying hair, sharp eyes, and an expression of quiet scrutiny. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," he greeted, motioning them to sit. "I must confess, I was not expecting you, but I gather this is about Lord Trevelyan." "Précisément," Poirot said smoothly. "You wrote to him, urging a response regarding a matter of urgency. I wish to know what that matter was." Lytton's expression tightened. "I am bound by legal confidentiality, Monsieur Poirot. I can hardly discuss a client's affairs." Poirot's gaze did not waver. "Even if that client is dead?" Lytton hesitated. "That complicates things." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Monsieur, I do not ask out of idle curiosity. I believe Lord Trevelyan's death, his missing journal, and the matters you corresponded about may be linked. Surely you would wish to see justice done?" Lytton exhaled, and after a moment unlocked a drawer in his desk, producing a file. "I can only tell you this much. A month ago, Lord Trevelyan was contacted by a woman claiming to be the rightful heir to the Trevelyan estate." Hastings let out a low whistle. "A lost heir? Good heavens!" Lytton nodded. "The woman, a Miss Eleanor Fontaine, claimed she was the illegitimate daughter of Lord Trevelyan's elder brother, who had supposedly married in secret. If her claim were true, she could contest the inheritance." Poirot's eyes flickered with understanding. "And Lord Trevelyan? How did he respond?" Lytton's fingers drummed lightly on the desk. "At first he dismissed it as nonsense, but then he requested an investigation. He withdrew a large sum of money, which I suspect was intended for someone, either to secure evidence or to silence the matter." Poirot's brow furrowed. "Did he meet with Miss Fontaine?" Lytton sighed. "That I do not know. I never heard from him again." Poirot considered this carefully. "Do you have an address for Miss Fontaine?" Lytton hesitated. "I shouldn't." But as Poirot fixed him with an unblinking stare, he relented, pulling a paper from his file. "This is the last known address she provided." Poirot took the slip of paper and read it. "Merci, Monsieur Lytton. You have been most helpful." As they exited the office, Hastings turned to Poirot. "Do you think this Miss Fontaine is involved in the theft of the journal?" Poirot's expression was unreadable. "Perhaps, or perhaps, mon ami, she is another piece in a puzzle larger than we yet understand." The two men hailed a cab and set off for Miss Fontaine's address. However, when they arrived, they were met with an unsettling sight. The modest boarding-house in which she had stayed appeared abandoned. The landlady, a plump woman with a suspicious glare, answered the door with reluctance. "Miss Fontaine?" she repeated when asked. "Gone. Left suddenly 2 nights ago." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Did she leave a forwarding address?" The landlady shook her head. "No, sir. Just packed up and went. Funny thing, though, she seemed frightened. Kept looking over her shoulder like someone was after her." Hastings frowned. Do you recall if she had any visitors? The landlady pursed her lips. A gentleman came once, didn't give his name. Tall, dark-haired, well-dressed, didn't stay long, but she was all shaken up after. Poirot exchanged a glance with Hastings. And her room, madame? Might I see it? The landlady grumbled, but led them upstairs. The room was small, neat, and impersonal. Poirot moved about, examining the space with keen eyes. Finally, he paused by the writing desk, where an envelope had slipped between the drawers. He fished it out carefully and inspected its contents. Inside was a single sheet of paper, hurriedly scrawled, "He knows. I must leave before it's too late." There was no signature. Hastings exhaled. Well, that doesn't sound ominous at all. Poirot tapped a finger against the paper. Miss Fontaine was running from something, or someone. The question, mon ami, is whether she ran fast enough. As they left the boarding-house, Poirot's mind was already turning over the possibilities. A missing heir, a stolen journal, a frightened woman who had vanished without a trace, and at the heart of it all, an hourglass that was more than just a trinket. It was a secret worth killing for. Chapter 6. The Vanishing of Miss Fontaine. Poirot and Hastings stepped out of the boarding-house into the London afternoon. A heavy silence hung between them. The note left behind by Miss Fontaine spoke of fear, of someone knowing something she wished to keep hidden. And now she was gone. Hastings shook his head. "I say, Poirot, this is turning into quite the tangle. First, Lord Trevelyan is murdered. Then his journal is stolen. And now this woman, who might have had a claim to his estate, has vanished." Poirot nodded slowly. "Oui, mon ami, and what is most interesting is the manner of her disappearance. She did not leave of her own accord to start a new life. She left in fear. That suggests a pursuer, does it not?" Hastings looked thoughtful. "You think she was being threatened?" Poirot raised a finger. "Not only threatened, Hastings. I suspect she was silenced. Whether she is dead or merely in hiding, we must determine at once. There is a great difference, mon ami, between one who disappears by choice and one who is forced into oblivion." They hailed a cab and returned to Poirot's London lodgings. Poirot had insisted on keeping a place in the city, despite preferring the quiet of his country home. The moment they arrived, he rang up Inspector Japp. "Ah, Japp, my old friend. You are well, I trust?" Poirot said with practised charm. A gruff reply came through the line. "What do you want, Poirot? I know that tone of yours. You've got another case that you expect me to sort out, haven't you?" Poirot smiled. "Ah, mon cher Japp, you do me an injustice. I only require a small favour. Could you ascertain whether there have been any reports of a young woman named Eleanor Fontaine being found? Either alive or, how shall we say, departed?" Japp grumbled. "I'll see what I can do. If she's turned up in any police reports, I'll let you know." Poirot thanked him and hung up. He turned to Hastings. "Now, mon ami, we must act. We have two paths before us. We may search for Miss Fontaine, or we may follow the stolen journal." Hastings leaned forward. "Surely the journal, Poirot. If we find that, we find the killer." Poirot steepled his fingers. "You think like a man of action, Hastings. But in this case, I believe the two mysteries are linked. If Miss Fontaine was afraid, it is likely she knew something about Lord Trevelyan's affairs. something that made her a threat. A knock at the door interrupted them. Poirot opened it to find a young messenger boy holding a folded note. "For you, sir," the boy said before darting away. Poirot examined the note carefully before opening it. The message inside was brief but chilling. "Stay away. You do not understand the danger you are in." There was no signature. Hastings peered over Poirot's shoulder. "Good heavens, Poirot! A warning! What do you make of it?" Poirot's eyes darkened. "It means we are on the right path, mon ami. Someone does not wish for us to continue our inquiries." Hastings paled slightly. "But who? The murderer?" Poirot tapped the note thoughtfully. "It could be, or it could be someone else entirely. There are forces at play here, Hastings. Forces we do not yet fully comprehend." Just then, the telephone rang. Poirot answered, listening carefully before nodding. "Merci, Jap. That is most illuminating." He hung up and turned to Hastings with a grim expression. "They have found Miss Fontaine." Hastings sat up straight. "Alive?" Poirot shook his head. "Non, mon ami. Her body was pulled from the Thames early this morning. She had been dead for at least a day." Hastings let out a low whistle. "So she didn't run away. She was murdered." Poirot nodded. "And that tells us something very important, mon ami. It means she knew something worth killing for." They wasted no time in heading to the police station, where Jap was waiting for them. The inspector looked weary, but determined. "She was found near Blackfriars Bridge," Jap said, leading them to the morgue. "No identification on her, but she matched the description you gave me. Cause of death? Strangulation. No sign of a struggle." Poirot studied the lifeless form on the table. Miss Fontaine had been young, perhaps no more than 25. There was a look of frozen fear on her face, her delicate features now devoid of life. "Strangled," Poirot murmured. "A personal method of killing." Hastings shuddered. "The poor girl! Do you think she was silenced before she could tell anyone what she knew?" Poirot nodded solemnly. "It is highly probable. But the question remains, who did she fear, and why?" Jap crossed his arms. "There's something else. We found something in the pocket of her coat." He held up a small golden object. Miniature hourglass. Poirot's expression did not change, but Hastings could see the sharp glint in his eyes. "So," Poirot murmured, "the hourglass again." Jap frowned. "What's the significance of it?" Poirot tapped a finger against his lips. "That, my dear Jap, is what we must discover. But one thing is now certain. This is not a simple murder. It is part of something larger, something that has already claimed 2 lives." Hastings swallowed hard. "Then we need to find that journal, Poirot." Poirot smiled slightly. "Yes, mon ami, and I believe I now know where to start looking." Jap raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and where's that?" Poirot straightened his cuffs. "Where all secrets are eventually uncovered, my dear Jap, back at the scene of the crime." Chapter 7. Shadows at Trevelyan House. The night was cool and crisp as Poirot and Hastings arrived once more at Trevelyan House. The grand London residence of the late Lord Trevelyan stood in stark contrast to its grim history. First the murder, then the theft of the journal. And now the discovery of Miss Fontaine's lifeless body. Hastings glanced warily at the darkened windows. "I say, Poirot, do you really think we'll find anything here? The police have already searched the house from top to bottom." Poirot gave him a knowing smile. "Ah, mon ami, that is precisely why we must search again. The police look for the obvious. Poirot, however, looks for the hidden." Japp had reluctantly agreed to grant them access to the house for the evening. The inspector himself had not joined them, having more pressing matters at Scotland Yard, but a constable was stationed at the front gate, watching the property. Poirot stepped inside first, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. "Observe, Hastings, the house. It is untouched since the murder, yet it is no longer the same, n'est-ce pas?" Hastings frowned. "It seems just as it did the first time we were here." "Non," Poirot corrected gently. "It seems empty. A house with a secret is never truly empty." Poirot's gaze flickered toward the study where Lord Trevelyan had been killed. The crime scene had been tidied, but an air of finality still hung in the room. The large oak desk, the bookshelves filled with expensive but unread volumes, and the thick drapes that shut out the city, all seemed undisturbed. Yet Poirot's keen eyes took in every detail anew. Hastings sighed. "The journal was taken from here, wasn't it? If only we knew who took it." Poirot gestured to the desk. "Come, Hastings, let us pretend we are the thief. Let us retrace his steps." Hastings stepped closer. Well, he or she must have come here after the murder, searched the desk and taken the journal. Poirot nodded. "Bon. And where would a thief hide such an object?" "In their own house, I suppose," Hastings offered. "Perhaps," Poirot mused. "Or perhaps they were cleverer than that." He stepped toward the fireplace, where a grand clock rested on the mantelpiece. It was a fine timepiece, gilded and elegant, but Poirot seemed particularly interested in the small golden hourglass placed beside it. "The hourglass again," Hastings murmured. Poirot picked it up and turned it over, watching the fine grains of sand trickle down. "Curious, no? A symbol that has now appeared twice in our case." Hastings looked puzzled. "But what does it mean?" Poirot set the hourglass back down. "That, mon ami, is what we must decipher." They continued their search, but nothing else of importance revealed itself. Poirot eventually declared, "Come, Hastings, we must leave." Hastings was taken aback. "But we've hardly found anything." Poirot smiled cryptically. "Ah, but we have, mon ami. You simply do not see it yet." As they exited the study, Poirot suddenly stopped, his eyes narrowing. A faint sound echoed from the upper floor. A creak. Poirot held up a hand for silence. Hastings whispered, "Is someone here?" Poirot did not answer. He moved carefully toward the staircase, placing his feet lightly on each step to avoid making noise. Hastings followed, heart pounding. The upper corridor was dim, moonlight filtering through the windows. Poirot moved toward the master bedroom, where the door stood slightly ajar. Another sound, a rustling. Poirot pushed the door open swiftly. A shadow moved. Someone darted towards the balcony. "Stop!" Hastings shouted, but the figure was quick. Poirot lunged for the heavy drapes, yanking them aside to allow more light into the room. The intruder was a woman, her dark cloak billowing as she leapt over the balcony railing. Hastings rushed forward, expecting to see her plummet to the street below, but she did not. Instead, she landed with practised ease on the iron railing of the lower floor's terrace, then disappeared into the night. Hastings gasped. Who the devil was that? Poirot's eyes glittered with interest. That, mon ami, is the question of the hour. They rushed down the stairs, but by the time they reached the garden, the woman had vanished. The constable stationed outside had seen no one pass. Hastings huffed in frustration. A thief! But what was she looking for? Poirot's expression darkened. That, Hastings, is what concerns me most. She was not searching. She was retrieving something. Something she had hidden here before. Hastings frowned. But what? Poirot did not answer immediately. He turned back toward the house, his gaze once again drawn to the study's fireplace. The hourglass, he murmured. Hastings blinked. You mean? Poirot stepped back inside, striding directly to the mantel. He lifted the small golden hourglass, his fingers carefully feeling along its frame. Then, with a soft click, he twisted its base. The hourglass came apart. Inside, hidden within the golden frame, was a tiny rolled-up piece of paper. Hastings gasped. The journal? Poirot shook his head, carefully unrolling the fragile parchment. His sharp eyes skimmed the words before he smiled triumphantly. Not the journal, mon ami, but a clue. Hastings peered over his shoulder. The note was short, but its meaning was unmistakable. Meet me at midnight, the golden hourglass. Hastings frowned. The golden hourglass? But isn't that just a trinket? Poirot's smile deepened. Non, mon ami, it is a place, and I suspect it is where our next answers await. Hastings let out a low whistle. Then we go there at midnight? Poirot nodded. Oui, and we must be very careful, Hastings, for I believe we are not the only ones who will be there. Chapter 8. Midnight at the Golden Hourglass. The Golden Hourglass was an establishment that Hastings would have never expected to feature in one of their cases. Unlike the lavish hotels or country manors they often visited in pursuit of truth, this place was a far less refined affair. Nestled in a quiet street off the Thames, it was a private club, exclusive, discreet, and rumoured to cater to individuals who preferred their affairs to remain in the shadows. As Poirot and Hastings arrived outside its modest facade just before midnight, Hastings could not suppress his disapproval. I say, Poirot, are you sure about this place? It looks rather unsavoury. Poirot merely adjusted his cuffs and gave a small smile. Ah, mon ami, that is precisely why it is of interest. It is not in the places of honesty that crimes are plotted, but in the corners where the light does not reach. Hastings sighed, but followed Poirot inside. The interior was surprisingly elegant, though in a way that suggested old money and secrecy rather than warmth. The room was softly lit, with plush velvet chairs and quiet figures seated in booths and corners, speaking in hushed tones. A polished bar gleamed under the dim light, its shelves stocked with the finest spirits. The patrons barely looked up as Poirot and Hastings entered. The clientele here were accustomed to ignoring others, just as they expected to be ignored. Poirot led the way to a booth near the back, where he could observe the room. A waiter approached, raising an eyebrow at their présence. "A drink, gentlemen." "Non, merci," Poirot replied smoothly. "But perhaps you can tell me, does a lady in a dark cloak frequent this establishment?" The waiter's expression did not change. "We don't discuss other guests, sir." Poirot gave a small nod. Of course. Discretion, it is your finest quality, n'est-ce pas? But tell me, if a certain lady were to enter, would she perhaps meet someone in private?" The waiter hesitated, then shrugged. "The private rooms are for members only." Poirot smiled. "Ah, I understand. And if one were to overhear whispers of such a meeting?" The waiter regarded Poirot for a long moment before finally leaning in slightly. "Room 3, he murmured before straightening and walking away. Poirot tapped the table lightly. "Come, Hastings. It appears our mystery lady is already here." They rose from their seats and made their way toward the hallway, leading to the private rooms. The door marked Room 3 was slightly ajar. Poirot placed a finger to his lips and gently pushed it open just enough to see inside. A woman sat at a small table, her face partially obscured by the hood of her dark cloak. Opposite her sat a man, his face turned away, but his posture stiff and wary. Poirot listened intently. "Is the last time. I did what you asked." The woman's voice was tense. "You haven't done enough." The man's voice was low but firm. "There's still the journal. You said you could retrieve it." "I tried," the woman hissed, "but that detective, Poirot, he's getting too close." Hastings inhaled, sharply, but Poirot steadied him with a firm grip. "We don't have time," the man continued. "If the journal resurfaces, everything falls apart." "Then you deal with it," the woman snapped. "I've risked enough." Silence. Then, at last, the man sighed. "Fine, but if you fail me, I won't protect you." The woman stiffened, and the man rose from his seat. Poirot quickly pulled Hastings back into the shadows as the door opened. The man stepped out, his face finally visible in the dim light. Hastings let out a whisper of shock. "Good Lord, that's—" Poirot's eyes gleamed with understanding. "Yes, Hastings, we have found our true puppet master." The man strode toward the exit, leaving the woman behind. Poirot did not move. He waited. Inside the room, the woman slumped in her chair, rubbing her temples. Then, after a moment, she reached into her cloak and pulled something out, something small, something golden. Hastings craned his neck to see. "Is that—" Poirot's whisper was triumphant. The missing piece of the puzzle. Chapter 9. The Trap is Set. Poirot and Hastings slipped out of the golden hourglass. The night air was crisp, but Hastings felt an unmistakable weight pressing upon him. His mind was racing with the implications of what they had just witnessed. "Can hardly believe it," Hastings murmured as they walked toward the waiting cab. "That man, the one in the private room, it was Sir Reginald Whitcomb, wasn't it?" Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. "Oui, mon ami. The Honourable Sir Reginald, so very respected, so very influential. And yet he moves in the shadows, whispering threats to a desperate woman." Hastings shook his head in disbelief. "But why? What does he have to do with this? What possible reason could a man of his standing have for being involved in blackmail?" Or worse, Poirot gave him a knowing look. Ah, Hastings, you are still thinking of men by their titles, their social positions. But crime, mon ami, does not respect rank. The wealthy and powerful commit misdeeds just as often as the poor. It is only that they are more adept at covering their tracks. Hastings frowned. And the woman. She had something in her hands. A small golden object. Do you think it was the missing piece of the hourglass? Poirot finished. Yes, I believe so. But more importantly, Hastings, she confirmed one thing for us. Sir Reginald is afraid. The two men climbed into the cab, and Poirot gave the driver an address in Mayfair. Hastings arched an eyebrow. "We're not returning to Whitehaven House?" Poirot shook his head. "No, mon ami. First, we must visit an old friend." Hastings waited until they arrived at a stately townhouse in the heart of Mayfair. Poirot rapped sharply on the door, and after a few moments a familiar figure answered. "Chief Inspector Japp," Hastings exclaimed. Japp, looking tired but alert, gave them both a wary glance. "Poirot! Hastings! I had a feeling you'd be turning up sooner or later. What's this about?" Poirot stepped inside without invitation. "Mon cher Japp, I have for you a name, a motive, and a final move to make in this little game of ours." Japp sighed. "I was afraid you'd say that." The three men gathered in Japp's study, where Poirot began laying out his case. Key to everything, mon ami, is the missing journal," Poirot said. "Lady Whitcomb's journal. It contains secrets that Sir Reginald cannot allow to come to light." Japp frowned. "And you believe he's willing to kill to keep it hidden?" Poirot's gaze sharpened. "I do not believe it, Japp. I know it." He proceeded to explain what they had overheard at the Golden Hourglass. How Sir Reginald had been pressuring the woman to retrieve the journal. How he had made veiled threats. Japp ran a hand over his face. "Blast it, Poirot. If you're right, this isn't just about a murder. It's about blackmail, fraud, maybe even treason. Sir Reginald is no small fish." Poirot smiled. "Ah, but even the largest fish may be caught, if one baits the trap correctly." Japp eyed him warily. "And I suppose you have a plan?" Poirot nodded. "Indeed. But for it to work, we must invite all the players to the final act." Japp sighed. "And what exactly do you need me to do?" Poirot's smile widened. "First, you must prepare an arrest warrant. And then, mon ami, we shall gather our suspects at Whitehaven House. The truth, at last, will be revealed." Hastings felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew what was coming. Poirot's grand denouement, the moment of unmasking. Tomorrow, everything would come to light. Chapter 10. Poirot unmasks the truth. The drawing-room of Whitehaven House was filled with an air of tension. The heavy velvet drapes were drawn, and the dim golden glow of the chandeliers reflected off the polished mahogany furniture. The assembled guests, no, suspects, sat stiffly in their chairs, their faces a mixture of impatience, curiosity, and barely concealed anxiety. Sir Reginald Whitcomb sat with his cane resting against his knee, his expression a mask of dignified indifference. Across from him, Lady Margaret Whitcomb clutched a handkerchief tightly, her face pale. Beside her sat Mr. Henry Lawson, the family solicitor, his brow furrowed as he toyed with the chain of his pocket watch. There was also Miss Evelyn Marsh, the anxious lady's companion, who sat rigidly upright, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. In the corner stood Chief Inspector Japp, his arms crossed, eyes keenly observing the room, and at the centre of it all was Hercule Poirot, standing before the grand fireplace, his delicate fingers adjusting the cuffs of his immaculate suit. Hastings sat to the side, notebook in hand, watching his friend with admiration. Poirot cleared his throat. "Mesdames et messieurs, I have gathered you all here because at last the time has come to uncover the truth. The tragic death of Lord Edward Whitcomb was no mere accident, it was murder." A collective murmur rippled through the room. Sir Reginald shifted in his seat. "Nonsense," he said dismissively. "The coroner ruled his death an accident. There was no evidence of foul play." "Ah," Poirot said, raising a finger. "That is precisely where you are mistaken, Sir Reginald. There was evidence, only it was cleverly hidden, overlooked by all but moi." Lady Margaret's voice trembled. "You mean someone killed my husband?" Poirot nodded solemnly. "Oui, madame. And the key to his murder lies in the missing golden hourglass, the very one that Lord Edward himself possessed, the one that vanished on the night of his death." Hastings leaned forward. "But Poirot, what could be so important about that hourglass?" Poirot turned toward the group. "That, Hastings, is the heart of the mystery. You see, the hourglass was not merely an ornament. It contained something, a secret so damning that someone was willing to kill to keep it buried." A silence fell over the room. Poirot continued, his voice measured. "The missing journal of Lady Whitcomb," he said, turning toward Margaret. "A journal that held a record of every financial transaction Lord Edward had undertaken, including one very particular payment, one that would expose a dangerous truth." Margaret gasped. "My journal! But it was destroyed." "No, madame," Poirot said gently. "It was stolen, and the thief was someone who had everything to lose if its contents became public knowledge." He turned sharply to Sir Reginald. "It was you, Sir Reginald." A stunned silence followed. Sir Reginald's eyes narrowed. "That's preposterous." "Is it?" Poirot's voice was quiet but firm. "You were the only one with access to both the hourglass and the means to remove the journal before it could be discovered. You knew that if Lord Edward revealed what he had found, your career, your entire standing, would be ruined. And so you took drastic action." He turned to Japp. "Inspector, you will find, if you examine the accounts of Whitcomb Investments, that a significant sum of money was funneled through a series of hidden transactions, payments linked to a fraudulent business venture orchestrated by none other than Sir Reginald himself." Japp pulled a folder from his pocket. "You mean these?" He waved the documents. "We traced them this morning. Shell companies, offshore accounts. It's all here," Poirot continued. "When Lord Edward found out the truth, he confronted you. You pretended to agree with him, acted as though you would help him expose the corruption. But instead, you plotted his murder." Lady Margaret let out a choked sob. You monster!" Sir Reginald's face darkened. "This is all speculation. You have no proof." Poirot smiled. "Ah, but I do." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small golden object. "The missing piece of the hourglass. Hidden inside this tiny compartment," Poirot said, was the final page of Lady Whitcomb's journal, the one that explicitly linked you to the fraud. You took the journal, burned what you could, but failed to notice that Lord Edward had hidden this piece away. Sir Reginald's face turned an ugly shade of red. Poirot stepped closer. That is why you killed him. You waited until he was alone in the study, took the hourglass, and when his back was turned, struck him over the head with it. The fall made it appear as though he had simply tripped and hit his head against the desk. You then disposed of the hourglass, breaking it apart to remove the journal pages. Hastings shook his head in disbelief. And yet, the one clue you overlooked was the very piece you left behind. Japp took a step forward. Sir Reginald Whitcomb, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Lord Edward Whitcomb. Sir Reginald stood abruptly, his face contorted in rage. You have nothing! I refuse! But Japp was already signalling to the officers waiting outside. Within moments, the once powerful Sir Reginald was being led away, his protests echoing down the hall. A heavy silence settled over the room. Poirot turned to Lady Margaret. Justice has been served, madame. She looked at him with tears in her eyes. Thank you, Monsieur Poirot. I only wish it hadn't come to this. Poirot inclined his head solemnly. Alas, madame, greed and deception often walk hand in hand. But now the truth is known. As the guests departed, Hastings turned to Poirot. Well, old chap, another. Case solved. You never cease to amaze me. Poirot gave a small smile. Ah, mon ami, it is not I who amaze, but human nature itself. The lies people tell, the masks they wear. All it takes is a little order and method to see through them. As he straightened his cuffs, he added, Now, Hastings, I believe we have earned ourselves a well-deserved supper. Come, let us go. And with that, Hercule Poirot walked out into the night, his little grey cells having once again triumphed over the forces of deception.